Coming up on the live and interactive ACSA legislative lunch break, Edgar and I will get you all of your latest news and information from the state capitol and CDE with an in-depth analysis on how it impacts you. Plus, we are talking about the California education budget. We've got one of our ACSA legislative lunch break legends, budget experts on the show to predict what we will see come the January governor's budget proposal.
The ACSA legislative lunch break starts now.
And it's just after 1 o'clock. We welcome you on a Wednesday to the live and interactive ACSA legislative lunch break, along with Dr. Edgar Zazweta, ACSA's executive director. I'm Naj Ali Khan, ACSA's senior director of marketing and communications. Welcome. Go ahead and jump into the chat and say hello and let us know where you're watching from today on the very last episode of the lunch break for 2024. It is the festive holiday edition of the lunch break, and you can see Edgar and I going full festive here as we kick off the final show of 2024.
The only thing, Naj, I was thinking about, you know how, and you and Michael or, your former TV people here. And the one thing I feel like we're missing, and maybe just let's put it on the to-do list. We need some like Christmas trees in the background. And I think our backdrop needs to be a little bit more holiday,
more festive
here. Yeah. Go get us a nice set for the holiday edition. Come on. It's not asking too much.
I was going to say, when we did this that first year and I was broadcasting from my wife's kindergarten classroom, the number of our viewers that commented that they loved the Santa Claus and snowman Christmas projects that were on the whiteboard right behind me. I mean, it was like literally dozens of people said how much they liked them.
Can we go out there? We're across the street from the state Christmas tree. Can we go do a show out there? Just the Christmas tree in the background.
You know what? I think this is the opportunity for us to blame the production staff that's behind the scenes.
Let's step it up here. Yeah, a green screen. I mean, and we'll see. I think this is where AI and whatnot, I think we may need to think outside of the box here. So
yeah, absolutely. Patty Herrera is going to be joining us, ACSA legislative lunch break legend Patty Herrera, to talk a little bit about the California state budget. Want to say hello, Jesus Montana, first on the chat today, as well as Jason Angle. Good to have you guys here. Edgar, a couple of news headlines that I just want to hit, and we told you last week, Edgar, about that report from NBC that President-elect Trump was planning to remove some regulations that have prevented immigration agents from going onto what are called sensitive locations, including hospitals, churches, and schools, to locate undocumented immigrants. Senator Lena Gonzalez here in California is introducing legislation that's being sponsored by the state superintendent of public instruction, aimed at preventing immigration officials from entering school campuses. The legislation would require immigration and customs enforcement and other federal authorities to have a judicial warrant to enter a school. It would also implement a 1 mile radius around schools, a safe zone for immigrant families that would prevent police from working with ICE agents. I want to make mention, Edgar, and this was key to the discussion that we had last week with Namita Brown from F3 Law. She talked about federal policies supersede state policies. So we're going to see how this proposed legislation could be impacted by orders from the Trump administration. I know that we've talked, Edgar, about ACSA is going to keep doing the work. And I know this story because it broke about 90 minutes before our show last week. It kind of took some time for us to really dig into the details of it and what the current state and federal laws, what exists. But I think this is another one of those wait and see moments for us, Edgar, where there's legislation that's proposed, but we don't know what happens on the other end of it.
I'll reiterate a piece that I think that was part of the conversation last week, and I know we've seen this in a lot of different avenues. I know we'll have a column in EdCal in January, kind of speaking to just where our organizational perspective on this is. We and us as ACSA, but more importantly, our folks, in the field, have a responsibility to serve every student that comes on their footsteps, right? That comes on their doorstep, I should say, regardless of documentation status, regardless of anything else. And I would even say, regardless of our members, which we understand, and like we've said over and over again, diverse political perspectives. That's why we see this as yes, it's politics. Yes, we're obviously talking about it in the context of the election. But despite, even if it sometimes differs from even people's views on, let's say, immigration enforcement, when it comes to an issue like this of having ICE agents coming into campuses that's supposed to be a safe space, not only for students, but for their parents, this is one of those places where we are going to draw a line in the sand, and we're going to push hard against this, right? Right now, we're taking the perspective on the resources. We had Namita on last week. We've had other legal partners in some other venues. It's going to be a big topic of the conversations in our conferences in January. So obviously, we're trying to work that angle on the resources end. In terms of the advocacy, I think this is one of those places where we're going to continue to express our voice. You hit it on the head, Naj. All the advice we've been giving, it's under the premise of current protections. Should some of those change because of policy changes in DC, that does change the landscape. We're going to have to revise some of those suggestions. Now, the California interaction will be an interesting one in terms of what happens in the state capitol, and does it matter if federal law does change it? So, obviously, I know a lot of stress in a lot of communities around this, where this has become an organizational priority, as we keep talking about every week. I'm sure that's going to only escalate as we get into January. So a lot more to come. And I know we'll have a lot more to say on this important topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Do want to make note of one other piece. On Monday, the governor released the final framework of the California Master Plan for Career Education. The plan is designed to strengthen career pathways, prioritize hands-on learning and real-life skills, and advance educational access and affordability. The state has, in this plan, will establish career passports to help workers showcase their skills and experiences to potential employers. And funding for the master plan would apparently be in the budget at the upcoming state budget. Now, after reading through this, I went and talked with some of our members from our career technical education community. And one discussion that keeps coming up, and I know you hear this discussion often when we meet with our groups, is about funding. And they talk specifically about the bifurcated funding system to support students. But it sounds like maybe some of this is now coming together, Edgar. So a little bit of advocacy from our members over time has certainly moved us in a positive direction. And I think certainly one of the goals of all of our councils is to be able to advocate on specific pieces, Edgar. So this is certainly good news. I do want to point out a couple of things over here on our chat. Leslie Wagonseller says we need to do a live show, Man on the Street. I just want to point that out. So she's saying that. Deanna Coolian points out Penn State in the football playoffs. If we take a wide shot of me, I've got my Let's Go Penn State lights up here. But let me just speak to, there you go. See? Right there. And then let me point out one thing, because I am a little disappointed in this particular member, and that's Sheldon. Okay. We're talking budget, and Sheldon was not the first one on the chat today. Sheldon, you've got to act a little bit faster. I believe he was on like 5 minutes early the last time we talked, but he was also, I think,
he's retired now. He's on leisurely schedule.
I know. He's on his own schedule. That's for sure. Okay. So January, we get the budget proposal from the governor. This time of year, we like to think about what could be in that budget proposal, especially as we start moving our way into the budget discussions in our school districts. And joining us today, Patty Herrera, Executive Vice President at School Services of California. She is also an ACSA Legislative Lunch Break legend, part of the Five Timers Club. I believe this is her sixth time with us since we've been on. And Patty, festive background. Thank you.
She got the memo here. She's that's what happens when you're a veteran.
Exactly.
Well, and my team is doing so much better than your team.
I know. We won't even go into that, Patty. We won't even go into that. Hey, maybe 2025 will bring on something better for my Chicago.
This is why I don't talk NFL and I don't talk football because
I,
of the team I root for. So let's
who is the
let's
team
move
you
on.
root for?
Let's move on. Let's move.
All right, Patty. So let's just kind of dive into this. Last year, the Legislative Analyst's Office sent out their fiscal report, and then the governor had his January budget proposal release, and the numbers were completely different. There was certainly a different picture being painted between the two entities. So how does your team kind of forecast what is coming to us in January with the budget proposal?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's a really important question. It frankly it didn't surprise us when the LAO put out their November estimates last year that came in grossly under the prior June budget's estimates. We had thought that the June budget estimates were optimistic given what the stock market was doing at the time. And that we had delayed, taxes that were coming in. So we had projected that there was a lot of risk to that budget. And sure enough, when the LAO came out just a few months later, they indicated that revenues were performing well below budget projections. What we do at School Services is we monitor, of course, state reports that are issued by the Department of Finance with respect to state revenues. We monitor that every single month, and we look particularly at certain months of the year that we know are really critical for the state budget general fund condition. We also monitor our friends at the Legislative Analyst's Office and the economic indicators that they look at. But then, as you guys know, we also attend the UCLA Anderson forecast seminars every quarter. And so we look at sort of the macroeconomic factors that we think impact our state budget condition or things that make our state budget factors that make our state budget sensitive. And so we look at it all, and but a key piece, it's hard to deny that a key piece of our information is really coming from our state partners like the Department of Finance and the Legislative Analyst's Office. I think this year we can expect the Legislative Analyst's Office revenue estimates to be closer to the governor's January estimates when he releases his January budget proposal on or before Friday, January 10th. It wouldn't surprise me if the governor is a little bit more optimistic than the Legislative Analyst's Office, because that's typically the case.
Right.
The LAO tends to be a little bit more conservative, but we don't expect to see a wide differential between the two.
Dr. Herrera, thank you for always being so generous with your time on the lunch break. I know you're a fan favorite, but not just here, but in so many other settings. I know I feel like you've come to a number of our gatherings. So
I was promised ACSA cards, Edgar, and I'm still.
Naj makes promises that he didn't run by me, so I don't. I have to talk to him.
Look, Patty. Well, honestly, we're lucky that the internet is working over here because Edgar is not paying the bills. I'm just making sure.
Hey, it's working better than when it worked for Megan.
That's true.
With School Services over here a couple weeks ago, it was a little choppy there. So
yeah,
we'll talk about that later. So Patty, the LAO report calculated that Prop 90, the guarantee was going to be at a 1.3% above the enacted budget level, total of $1.5 billion. That's a modest increase. I know you guys have talked about this. You were just alluding to just kind of your projections. What do you say about the guarantee? What's your kind of initial assessment of what the LAO had to say there?
Honestly, everything that was included in the fiscal outlook report from late November from the LAO wasn't anything surprising to us, except the COLA projections. And we talked about this at a recent meeting that you were kind enough to invite me to, and we can talk about that a little bit, because that's one of the things that I think that folks need to keep an eye on. But with respect to their revenue estimates and the corresponding estimates to Proposition 98, particularly for the budget year 25-26, it's not surprising to us. When you look at the details of the LAO's fiscal outlook report, what you see is that they think year over year from 24-25 to 25-26, general fund revenues are actually going to decline. They think there's going to be like a $3 billion decline in general fund revenues year over year. And that's just because we're having sort of a banner year in 24, 25, right? The stock market, setting aside what's happening today because they're reacting to the Federal Reserve's action on the federal funds rate. But the stock market had been in record territory. And of course, that means that's really good news for our general fund. And they don't anticipate things like the stock market are going to continue to grow at that pace moving into 25, 26. We're also anticipating headwinds. And the UCLA Anderson forecast that came out last week also indicate or share those same predictions about the headwinds that we could be facing, particularly with the incoming Trump administration and some of the policies that they are considering implementing, like tariffs on Mexico and Canada, and then even the Trump's immigration policies, that all of those things could reignite inflation, which are going to create economic headwinds for 25, 26. So the LAO's report is, we think, is reasonable, and projections are reasonable. It's not a downward trend, because the loss in general fund revenues, or the reduction in general fund revenues, is actually offset by increases in California property taxes, and those two things combined are the ones that determine the Proposition 98 guarantee. So it's a modest increase. It's nowhere near like an economic recession scenario, but it wasn't anything that was a surprise to us.
And folks, if you have questions for Patty, go ahead and put those into the chat. We'll try and tackle some of those at the end of the show. I know, Patty, that you had mentioned COLA in your last response, but let's talk about new commitments, because the LAO is pointing out an additional $3.7 billion being freed up with the expiration of some one-time costs. And then after factoring in the statutory COLA, we really have about $2.8 billion available. Having money is good. Putting that in the hands of lawmakers to decide where that money is going to go, maybe not so good. Is it good for us to have that little surplus amount of money, or is this one of those years where discretion makes a lot more sense?
Always good to have surplus, right? That's never a bad thing. The challenge that you raise, Naj, is how is the legislature and the governor going to give us that money? You know, they owe that money to us. It's constitution. They are constitutionally obligated to give it to us. The question is, are they going to give it to us in a way that makes sense for us at the local level and to meet, the needs of our students and address all our budget, issues. I think the thing to note as it relates, going back to COLA, is growth in Proposition 98 resources doesn't necessarily translate to year-over-year increases in revenues for school districts, right? Because what drives your revenues at the local level is your LCFF funding, and a big piece of that is COLA. How robust is COLA, and your declining enrollment? And we do know that many districts year over year can anticipate a reduction in LCFF revenue on an absolute dollar basis, right? So that increase in Proposition 98 resources doesn't necessarily translate to increases at the local level. So we have to solve for that. And I think a lot of our partners at the local level, they want to see those dollars come to them in a discretionary fashion, and not necessarily in like we'll give you this dollar, but when we give it to you, we want you to do X with it. And it's because we know that in California, we have such a diverse state, that the needs in every community can be vastly different. And our local educational leaders, they want the flexibility to be able to use those dollars in ways that make sense for their students and their families.
Patty, at this time, whether it be every 4 years, every 8 years, when there's a change in administration at the federal level, we always find ourselves asking ourselves this question as the transition is happening. What is this going to mean for education? What is this going to mean for education funding? And this part of the analysis, I know that you folks do that. Any thoughts on what we're seeing and what we heard, what some of the potential impact? But also, I think it's an opportunity to just remind our folks. I know there's also sometimes a lot of concern when they start hearing proposals about potentially cutting different federal streams, not to minimize that, but also just in the context of our full education picture of how much of that is federal as opposed to worrying about what happens here in Sacramento, but just generally speaking on what's happening in DC, what are you folks telling the field on the federal front?
I think one of the things that we sort of redirect everybody's attention to is just how much California relies on federal funding, and without downplaying the impact of federal Title I funds and federal Title III funds, particularly at the school site level. Those dollars are really meaningful when they get down to the school site level. But when you zoom up to that higher level, when you're talking about a Proposition 98 minimum guarantee of almost $120 billion, federal support across all titles, Title I, II, III, IV, it really just pales in comparison. It's a fraction of a percentage of what we get as school districts from the federal government. So we always want to temper our reactions to changes in Washington against really who do we rely on for our resources. And there is no doubt that we rely most heavily on the state of California for our resources. So with that said, nevertheless, the uncertainty that's coming with the Trump administration and the policies that have been discussed by those who are influencing the Trump administration, are certainly something for us to continue to monitor and think about, and they will have an impact. So for example, the task force, DOGE, I think is what they call it, right? That Elon Musk is co-leading with another organization. If they reduce the size of, government, or deregulate certain parts of government, that could have an impact on education. The question is how much impact it could have. I continue to think, you guys, and maybe I am understating this. I actually continue to think that probably the most threatening thing is the gridlock in Washington, because they can't seem to pass a budget, or it's we're getting down to the wire on Friday's deadline to keep the government open. Right. That could have real impact, even more so than the policies that are being sort of touted around in terms of what we can expect with the second Trump administration.
Patty, let me just ask you on behalf of our members, from our SUPs to our CBOs to our assistant principals, what should we be looking out for here as we turn the clock from 24 into 25, looking ahead to 26? What's the one or two things that they need to be looking out for right now?
So two things come to my mind. One, I've already talked about and I alluded to, which is the cost of living adjustment for 25-26. All of our districts passed a multi-year budget back in June that assumed in 25-26, they would expect about a 3% COLA, 2.93% COLA. The LAO's fiscal outlook report came out in November and indicated that their most recent estimate is a 2.46% COLA. That's already lower than what everybody had assumed in their June budget adoptions, right? So you're already having to, I'm going to call it value engineer your multi-year budgets from June. And the thing, Naj and Edgar, that I was alluding to is we follow the COLA very, very closely in our office. And COLA is trending pretty low, and we can certainly, there certainly can be things that can affect the next 2 quarters of data. It's hard to imagine that it could affect it so much so that we could get up to that 2.93% anticipated level. I said this at your event a couple of weeks ago. The LAO's estimated COLA is certainly within reason, but in our estimates, it's on the higher end of reasonable. And so COLA could actually even come in lower than what the LAO's November forecast is. The reason why that's so important for our local districts is because this is what drives their local revenue. Again, it's not the growth year over year in Proposition 98. It's what you can expect from your LCFF, right? Your LCFF revenues from the state of California. So that COLA is going to be really, really important. You're already having to think about reducing because you included a more optimistic COLA estimate in June, and you may have to even reduce even more. The second thing that comes to my mind, and frankly, it's top of mind for all of us, is with the anticipation, I mean, President-elect Trump said in no uncertain terms that he intends to repeal that federal policy that declares school sites as protected areas. And that's something that we've been thinking about and discussing internally at School Services of California. And we're trying to think, to your point, Edgar, that you made earlier, is like, what kinds of resources could we put in the hands of our local educational leaders and our site leaders to help maintain academic continuity and instructional continuity for our students, as well as, and I hate to, but you know, I don't think this comes as any surprise to you guys that my mind is so fiscally driven, but you know, we think about the potential loss in ADA because students and their families might be fearful to send students to school. And so, so thinking about that, I without giving too much away, we internally we're discussing publishing an article for school districts to think about in terms of the opportunities that they might have to continue to offer instructional continuity and academic continuity to their students, as well as to protect against any ADA losses. So that'll be coming out in an article, hopefully within the next week or so.
You got a busy few weeks, that's for sure, over there
Yeah.
at School Services, Patty.
Hey, before I get booted off the screen, I just wanted you to know that I did create my background on AI this morning, and I was like, I just told them, make it an ugly sweater but feature the Steelers, right? And then I wanted to put a different background up, and
Yeah.
and this was the background that I thought I might put up. Thank you, Michael, for all your help.
That's
Patty
the beauty of
Herrera.
AI right there. Well, or maybe that's just a simple Google search when you type in Chicago Bears. I don't know.
Right.
There you go.
That's what
Well,
comes up.
look, she's not a Cleveland Browns fan. That I can absolutely tell you. Patty Herrera, Executive Vice President over at School Services of California. Patty, thanks so much for being with us today. And happy holidays and happy New Year to you.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy holidays to everyone as well.
And folks, I want to just give you a couple of pieces of information as we get ready to close out our show. I want to remind you about the ACSA Leadership Classroom. It's part of our ACSA Podcast Network. The newest episode, which launched on Tuesday, included a great interview with Sylvia Acevedo. She's a rocket scientist and also the former CEO of the Girl Scouts of the United States. She went from Girl Scout all the way to CEO of the Girl Scouts of America. It's a great interview. You can listen to that on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. QR codes available for you right there. Scan those as soon as the show is done. Listen to that great interview and all of our great content on the ACSA Podcast Network. Edgar, I know we've only got a few seconds here to wrap on this. As we head into the new year, Edgar, any last words for our members?
I mean, it's just a lot of reflection, right? It's been quite a year, and I'm sure we have. I mean, we talk about obviously all the concerns and whatnot, but I do want to just take a moment just to thank first of all our members and just this great organization that we get to be a part of, and it's really because of their work. I know we feel really privileged. So as we say oftentimes at this time of year, just we do hope, especially, you know, folks put in the work. So having a little bit of time to just enjoy their families and their loved ones over the holidays, I think is real important. And appreciate you, Naj. And we've been doing this for a while. You reminded me that we're almost at 200, and Michael and Gianna and the host of guests and the GR team that obviously is helping us behind the scenes. This is a lot of fun, and I'm glad we're still doing it. I know, though, you know, for all those people, when I got this gig a couple of years ago, more than they didn't care about my ACSA platform. They didn't care about you. They just want to know was I going to still do the lunch break. So I know there's been a couple of times where I thought I might get booted because I was missing too many weeks in a row. But I'm glad you guys have kept me around here.
Hey, we're glad you're here, Edgar. And happy holidays to you. We love having you here on the lunch break, and it's always a great half hour. But to our members, to our viewers, thank you as always for joining us here on the lunch break. We will be back in January to talk about the budget proposal. You can expect we'll have our live expanded edition of the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break in January. Until then, happy holidays to all of you. Have a great, happy new year. We'll see you in 2025.